This is Jenny Ma interviewing Mr. Norman Han at Kaifeng Glad Kosher Chinese restaurant at 6:53 on 9th of May 2011. And Mr. Han, thank you very much for seeing us today and do this interview for the British Chinese Food Culture Project. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And would really love to know when and why did your ancestors come to the UK?
I believe for economic reasons, like most Chinese. My grandfather came as a seaman and settled here. My father did the same, and of course my wife came from Shanghai, and I married her here. So we have always somebody coming from China, and my children, two of them are in Hong Kong. One is married, so she's married to a Hong Konger. Yes, so she lives in Hong Kong.
And I believe you're the third generation.
That's right.
Do you roughly know when did they come to the UK?
My grandfather, I believe, came around 1913. Yes, approximately. And so in 2 years' time, our family have been here 100 years.
That's amazing.
Yes, yes.
And we would love to know more about your working experiences, especially establishing Zhoukinglau and the Chinatown Chinese Association. We would love to know about your legacy.
All right, okay. I first came to London in 1963. I had been to hotel school in Liverpool, and I got a job as a general training manager in the London Hilton Hotel in Park Lane, which was just about to open. So I was the first general training manager that the Hilton had ever taken on. So that was the first. I was there from 63 until 66. And then I left, and I worked for a year, and I started business in 67. I opened the first Chinese takeaway shop. So that's another first. The Hilton experience was vital, actually. It also shaped my thoughts and mind about food and how food should be prepared. And of course the general training in hotels and so forth has given me the background to understand the food industry.
I mean, in Hilton, especially, what kind of influence that really shaped your thoughts?
I'm working with great people of great understanding of the business, whether they were chefs, managers, waiters, captains. You have to know that at that particular time, most of the food industry was either very high class or just the local cafe in the high street. So there's hardly anything in between. So I was privileged to work with some of the great chefs, great managers. I had the experience of working in all departments, in purchasing, in banqueting, engineering, front of desk, reception, you name it, housekeeping. So I worked in every area of the hotel. So I had an understanding of how the hotel worked. Each department I worked in, I had to prepare a report of my experiences. And in between, while I was working at the Hilton, I was invited by one hotelier in Switzerland to spend a season in Switzerland. So I actually had a break during the time I was at the Hilton to work in Switzerland, which I did 6 months, and then came back and worked in the Hilton again, which is another experience.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yes. So this grounding or this background, you must remember that in those days, a waiter was someone who had at least 7 years training, and he was a commis waiter, then a demi chef de rang, then a chef de rang. So the procedure today is, if you can hold 2 plates, you're a waiter. But by working with people who had this background of long training to become a waiter, and then to become a head waiter who had spent many years, and you must remember that these people had worked all over the world, so they brought with them vast numbers of years of experience. So we had, I think at the time I was working at the Hilton, perhaps there were 63 different nationalities. Can you imagine that? And the staff ratio was 2 to every customer. So you had a ratio that doesn't exist now. So the level of service was first class. And I suppose Hilton brought to England systems that didn't exist in English hotels, where you had, like I mentioned, I worked in the purchasing department, as opposed to having a hotel where the chef would make his orders. You had quality control by having a purchasing department. You had people who went out to the markets, who saw the vegetables, the fish, the meat, and so forth. And then, of course, all the way across the board, you had your linen and so forth, the furniture. It's all purchased by the purchasing department. And then you had banqueting. So you had banqueting sales. And then, of course, the back of the house, the procedures to make a banquet, whether it was the chefs, the waiting staff. So you have all these type of experiences. And the engineering. How does a hotel operate? How does it work? The aircon, the systems, the lifts, and so forth. And then...
Oh, sorry.
Please.
Then when did you establish Chinatown Chinese Association?
Well, I was one of several people who was in Chinatown. And we were threatened by the post office, who wanted to demolish Chinatown. So they wanted to literally take the post office and take it all the way to Newport Place. And all of that would have been demolished. So we formed an association to fight off the government or the local council, Westminster Council, to prevent this planning permission to compulsory purchase all the properties. And I suppose that was really how Chinatown came into existence. And it was very strange, actually. The Westminster City Council did not know Chinatown existed, because they said, what Chinatown? And I think it also put Chinatown on the map. So there were several things that happened at that time. First, we defeated the post office from developing further. And 2, we were given recognition in Chinatown that there was such a place. And it wasn't just myself, there were many others who were involved. We formed a committee to form the Chinatown Association, and we created positions, and subsequent to that I became president of Chinatown. But mainly the Mann family, I must give credit to the Mann family for being greatly involved in this. Manfort Tai was one of the principals who was behind this. And I think you can say that without us winning the battle to save Chinatown, there would be no Chinatown today. But even though at that particular time Chinatown was quite tiny, it consisted of not too many shops. You must remember that Chinatown had 1 or 2 shops. And it started with, like you have in most Chinese Chinatowns or I should say, cities with a Chinatown, and that is the Daidong, is the principle. Remember, today it doesn't exist because people have different forms of gambling, but in the old days, Chinese would gamble, and that was the focal point. So from there became people to provide the services to the Daidong, food and so forth. So the development took place from there, and then the needs to provide food, and then you had the Jiafopo and so forth, supermarkets coming in, and that expanded, and there were then competition, and there were more supermarkets, more restaurants and so forth.
And how do you feel about dealing with food as your career?
I don't know if it's a regret or not, but I mean, I've done many things in my life, and food is one of them. So I try to keep perspective. I'm not overwhelmed that I can only see food in my life. There are many things that interest me beyond food. But of course, food has brought me my living. Although I have been involved in property, and property is of great interest, and I get in fact, a great deal of enjoyment developing things. So I take pride in designing my own restaurants, my own business, whether in the past we've had, I was involved with Ao, and I used to design the offices myself. So this is something that I enjoy a great deal.
So, what is your favorite Chinese dish?
No, there are so many dishes to choose that I think it's almost impossible to say one particular dish seriously. I mean, two. I really couldn't say two. It's unfair because really Chinese food, I mean, it's so vast. There's so many dishes. It wouldn't do justice to just to say two dishes. I think, I mean, especially the variety you have.
How about the least favorite?
Least favorite. Again, I have universal taste, so I don't love, I don't hate. Maybe some foods I may not wish to eat so much, but I don't particularly hate any particular dish.
Can you tell us about the inspiration of establishing Kaifeng and its development?
Well, Kaifeng really came about, I must be very truthful about this. It was something that I got involved with because of my frustration of being involved with something quite different. I had spent 3 years of my life trying to develop a Chinatown in Birmingham. And for 3 years I traveled from London to Birmingham and assembled the land in Birmingham city centre, which would have made a very unique Chinatown that would have been from concept, incorporating every aspect of a Chinatown, and that meant planning for the Chinese love for gambling. So I designed a project that had casinos, betting offices, shops, restaurants, bars, and lots of more professional offices and so forth, even space for a bank. I then actually went out, having got the planning permission. I went out and how can I put it? I went out and actually got the tenant for every shop unit. So if we had a pub, and it was a planning consent for 600 person pub, And I went out and I went to all the local breweries, and we had a brewer. The casino, we went out to see the casinos, and I chose the casino operators. So every area of the project, I had someone. I had the Bank of China to go into the banking unit, or we were going to have a safety deposit box. So something incorporating much more than just a normal Chinatown, like for example London. It would have incorporated a lot more leisure and so forth. Unfortunately, it wasn't to be. And I was also promised by the local council to have all the land in front of the development, which amounted to tens of acres of land. So anyway, having not succeeded in this project, I spent some time at home, and a friend of mine called me and asked me whether I would be interested in a project. And he said I couldn't think of anyone else who could do this. He wasn't involved in food. So we met and had lunch. And 3 months later, it was a kaifeng. So from not knowing anything about kosher food or kosher restaurants, I opened kaifeng. And we are now renowned all over the world. So if you go to any Jewish community, seriously, in America, Canada, South Africa, Israel, literally anywhere in the world, if you speak to anybody who has a religious background, they will know kaifeng. We are probably the most famous kosher restaurant in the world. Seriously. And that makes us quite unique. We have some of the most famous people in the world coming here. Yes, we had Tony Blair in here. He's not Jewish, but he was invited to come in, and the particular person who invited him is now a lord. We had the leader of Israel, General Sharon, in here. We've had, one time we had 22 members of parliament, of the Israeli parliament, it's called the Knesset, who were in here. And then there is, I don't know if you guys follow the stock market, but there is a company called Glencore, which is going to have their IPO. Now, a lot of those people who came out of Mark Ridge, which became Glencore, they used to come and eat here. So we have people from all walks of life, and we have the leaders of all walks of life. The Jewish people excel in every field that they involve themselves in, whether it's medical or legal. On this table here, we once had 14 High Court judges having dinner. So we have... Continue. Sorry, otherwise I will go on about too many aspects of...
And what kind of food does kaifeng provide? Is it kosher food in Chinese style?
We have, yes, exactly. So we the only thing that differs is the meat, and the meat happens to be glad kosher, which enables us to cater for the more religious of the Jews. But our food is prepared by Chinese, and we have excellent chefs. We have 6 Chinese chefs in the kitchen, and apart from the meat being kosher, and of course the exclusion, of course, is we don't have shellfish, we don't have pork. So these are the items. So we have chicken, lamb, beef, duck, but we cannot have shellfish. All right.
And besides the kosher food, do you need to follow any cultural tradition like opening hours?
Oh yes, very much so. Our restaurant is controlled exclusively by a shomer. He's like a supervisor. We're under the London Beth Din United Synagogues. So they will provide us with a shomer who has the keys of the kitchen. We have no access to the kitchen. So from the morning, he opens the kitchen. He will light the flame of the gas. He will open the fridges and prepare the kitchen for opening. We have no access without him coming. He then will spend his time ensuring that all the food coming into the restaurant is kosher. He will ensure that the procedures that the chefs carry out are all in accordance with the kashrus laws. You must separate meat from the fish. We do have fish, but not shellfish. So the pots and pans have got to be clearly marked and separated. You cannot cook in the same pot. All right. He will clean the vegetables. This is one of his prime jobs, is to clean vegetables. So it's very meticulous. All the vegetables are soaked in salt water and examined for bugs. So you can say kosher is also about hygiene. And remember that these laws were laid down several thousands of years ago. And mainly you can see the salting of the meat, and the meat procedure is the same. The slaughter of the animal is killed the Chinese way, where they cut the throat and drain the blood out of the animal. The animal is checked to see if the animal is a healthy animal. So you can say that kosher food is healthy food.
How do you open the Jewish market for Kaifeng? Do you use a history of Jews in Kaifeng City?
We were very fortunate that when we opened Kaifeng, we thought, what name should we call this restaurant? So the name of Kaifeng came about. I asked a friend, tell me, I said, there must have been Jews in China. I said, could you find out where they were? And through the history books, he came out with the name of Kaifeng as one of the places that the Jews had settled in China. And so, as it happened, the Jews had gone to Kaifeng because it was part of the Silk Route. The Jews had come from Persia or Iran. So we have the Jews who settled there over 1,000 years and had built 2 synagogues over various times. One had been lost through fires and floods and subsequently rebuilt. The Jews of Kaifeng today hardly exist because of assimilation and mainly through economic reasons. If you can understand that goods traveled overland in the Silk Route, and as the sea lanes opened up and shipping came, the coastal regions developed economically. And I suppose that Jews gravitating towards business moved to places like Shanghai. And in some ways, I think Kaifeng was like Liverpool. It's lost its significance and reason to exist. But
how do you introduce this kosher Chinese food to the Jewish people?
Introducing wasn't a difficult thing. We were fortunate to choose the name Kaifeng after the Jews of Kaifeng. And on the week we opened, we were blessed with a very fortunate event. A very famous judge, his wife and several of the community had just come back from a visit to Kaifeng. So on the front page of the Jewish newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle, Judge Owen's wife returning from Kaifeng, and we opened that week, so it was almost like
the top.
Well, it was like a blessing from heaven that somebody had written. So we were very fortunate. Headlines in the newspaper. So we opened, and we were very fortunate that we had this publicity. And I'd never opened a business in my life that we were full from day one. So,
Do you know? Do you know if there is any other kosher Chinese restaurants?
Well, there have been there have been a few that have tried to copy us, and quite a number have fallen by the wayside. There's one which does some Chinese food, but they also do Japanese and do Thai, so you couldn't actually call it Chinese. But I'm sure that there will always be people who will try to emulate and imitate us.
Any difficulties or very interesting stories you have when you were developing Kaifeng?
I think we have a story almost every day. The Jewish community is a very interesting one. I mean, intellectually, you couldn't find another race of people who have such a diversity of thought and mind. So like I mentioned earlier, we could have judges here, we could have politicians, we could have very prominent business people, we could have someone from the professions, medical profession. I mean, we have Lord Winston, for example, the doctor who allows women to have children when they're infertile. So he did one of his programs here, which is a very interesting point actually. One of his programs was how children develop their taste buds. So we had the film crew here, and he was explaining how children develop taste buds. So this is just one of the people who's a regular customer, and you could extend that to so many other fields. We had the Chief Lord Justice of Singapore here being entertained, and it was Judge Lightfoot and another famous QC, who incidentally has been involved with the making of a lot of the laws of China. So when China started opening up, you have to develop law, contract law, and so forth. And he was with Judge Lightfoot and Lord Chief Justice of Singapore. So you can see we have people from all walks of life, but some of the highest forms of life as well.
How many, what's the percentage of Chinese customers in your restaurant in Kaifeng?
Very, very, very few, if at all. I mean, there are a lot of people who trade with China, visit China, so quite often they will bring their counterpart to the restaurant. So when they come out of China and come over to visit, we'll bring them here. So sometimes we have some Chinese trading companies who are dealing with Jewish clients. They ask, where can we go? So they will bring them here. So usually that's the only reason why, because we're also an expensive restaurant.
Do you use any MSG in your dishes?
Very little, very little, because it's again, a lot of Europeans today dislike MSG, so we tend not to use it if it's possible.
What is Kaifeng's most popular dish, you think?
I think it's probably the duck, hangsongap. Yes, and the chili beef. Probably these two probably are the favorites.
And do you develop new dishes quite regularly? And what is the inspiration?
Because we are not at the forefront of like the food business, and because most people have limited taste buds, when people come here, they always think of their favorite dish. So trying to wean people off what they normally eat is very difficult. There's a tendency for people, when they come here because they want that particular dish. And I think this is generally true. If you ask yourself, when you go out to eat, what do you normally do? You have a favorite, and you tend to eat that favorite. And Europeans are no different.
Is there anything else you would like to add about Kaifeng? Any funny stories?
Some I may not wish to be. There are so many, actually, hundreds, and I'm often asked to, people who say to me, you should write a book. And I've been asked countless of times, why don't you write it? And my rabbi, who was here, who I said passed away, unfortunately, 2 years ago, he would always say to me, write it down. He was 93 when he died, and he kept a diary all his life. So for him, it was routine that he did something like this. I suppose in some ways, it would have been a good idea to have written down, because I can tell you there are thousands and thousands of stories. And remember, Kaifeng is based on the family, and having been here for 25 years, we can see 3 generations of the family, and quite often 3 generations actually come and eat. But knowing the family and families going through 3 generations, somebody who's 15 is now 40, somebody who's 40 is now 65. So I think the connection with families is at the heart of Kaifeng.
What do you think of zapsoi, chop suey?
Chop suey, I think you have to know that it's an important. It forms an important part. Not everyone's taste buds are as refined as ourselves, for example. And when there are limited resources, if you have to go back, how did it all come about? You have, if you're overseas, whether it was America or here, Canada or Australia, you didn't have the availability of Chinese foodstuffs. So you would use vegetables, you would use more or less any ingredient to make a dish. And if you see some of the stories, incidentally, that maybe you watch a documentary on Africa or somewhere, it's always interesting to see how they started. And I saw a documentary from CCTV the other day. It was a Chinese, I think it was in Fuji Island or somewhere, who had developed a Chinese business and employed only local people. And he was using the ingredients, local ingredients, which the local people were using, and he made them taste Chinese. And I think you mustn't knock chop suey. Chop suey comes about because of, you can say it is actually, it's a style of cooking, but it differs. Chop suey will differ in Germany or in Holland or in Russia or in Poland, simply because what is available. And usually it's the other reason is because the owner may not have access to chefs and so forth, and often he may be the chef and owner of the business. So you have a typical chop suey.
Do you know which country started chop suey?
They tell me America.
America.
Yes, because the history of Chinese in America goes back to the laundry days. And after the people, remember, Chinese went there to build the railways and so on. And the ones who managed to not be sent back and stayed on in America either became laundry people, and after the laundries became chop suey. And I suppose the same applied in England. When I was a kid, you had lots of Chinese laundries and very few restaurants. And I suppose at that particular time you would say that they were serving chop suey. As you had more migrants coming over, and the accessibility to better food products. And remember this also coincided with an era when China wasn't exporting, and the conditions in China were not the best of conditions. So you had, even to get foodstuffs out wasn't so easy. So the development of chop suey, actually, which become to represent Chinese food, was actually simply because of lack of ingredients. But in all honesty, I mean, I have a friend who was in the fur business, and they said to me, when I go overseas, I can't eat the English food, but I keep a bottle of soy sauce in my pocket. This guy is from Hong Kong. He says, so I just put the soy sauce over the food, and then it tastes Chinese for me.
Do you know Ken Lo?
Ken Lo, I do, yes. And he started a food club. He, if I understand, was a diplomat's son and really had no idea about Chinese food. So I suppose looking for a way to make a living, he started a club, a gourmet club, I believe it was called. And when he first started, it just coincided with Joy King Lau opening, so he came several times.
In 1977.
Yes, and I remember he wrote on his notes to his clients, I remember he wrote a letter subsequent to that, and he said I salute you for bringing Chinese food to the forefront. And we had reviews from even Fei Mashler in those days, so it was I suppose Joy King Lau in some ways put Chinatown. I can't really say, because you had Chichenkoi, you had some other places who were open maybe a few years before Joy King Lau. But I advertised extensively. I was the first restaurant to go on black cabs, inside the cab at the beginning, until the law changed to allow external advertising. And so you used to see a Joy King Lau advertisement on the black cabs. So unfortunately, we used to have people from the Ritz in Savoy who would come because they would see and of course the doorman opening cabs would see Joy King Lau on the door and would recommend the clients to come. But we're a Chinatown restaurant. And, so there were lots of interesting stories from that. Please.
Can I just ask you, when exactly or roughly did you establish the Chinatown Chinese Association? What year and when?
Well, we were threatened around 69, and I suppose the existence of Chinatown came in between 69 and 72.
Thank you very much, Mr. Norman Han. Thank you so much for your interview for this British Chinese food culture Chinese food project. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.